Fel licht, hè? Hello, welcome everybody. Good evening to my colleagues here in the room and to my colleagues online and to you, the audience at home. My name is Sprangers. I'm the manager of the LeidenAsiaCentre, and tonight we're going to present our research on the Belt Road Initiative by interviewing 4 of the 12 researchers right here tonight, and we will conclude with an online discussion in which you can participate by going online to slido.com and use the code that you have been given here. Hopefully that slide will turn up now. Could I have the first slide with the program? Thank you very much. Thank you. The slide will come later, no doubt. In the meantime, let me introduce you to the director of the LeidenAsiaCentre, Dr. Florian Schneider, a senior lecturer at Leiden University and head of the China section and specializing in Chinese politics. And he will give an introduction to the research that we are about to finish. Florian, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Lily. Hello, everyone at home watching this. So we are here today to present to you some of the conclusions of a project that has been running for a year. So for the last 12 months, we've had a total of 12 people working on Belt and Road related issues, doing field work throughout 2019. And today we get to hear from some of them. Now, a couple of caveats are in order. One is that not all of our 12 speakers are joining us here tonight. We have a couple of people in the studio, and we have one other colleague, Matt, calling in from abroad at the moment. But you will be able to read all of the research, hopefully later this year, when we are planning to have the whole book together with all of the chapters, and that will be an open access publication. Now there's another caveat, and that is that the research as it took place throughout 2019 doesn't yet speak to issues of COVID-19. So while our researchers were conducting their work, the coronavirus was not quite yet on the horizon. And so quite a lot is currently changing throughout the BRI projects. I can say a little bit about this towards the very end, and maybe some of our speakers have some thoughts as well, just to update you on what is currently going on. But I should point out to you that that was not originally the focus of the research that we're now presenting to you. So the goal here is basically to present to you the results so far.
Okay, and could I ask you, in what way does this study distinguish itself from the avalanche of BRI publications that we have seen over the past few years?
Yes, I'm sorry if I had you correctly. You're wondering what distinguishes this from previous research, right? So I would say, in general, it's important to realize that the field has matured quite significantly. So in the early years of Belt and Road Initiative research, there was quite a lot of dichotomy, quite a lot of dichotomies at work, where either China was a villainous entity run by the Communist Party that was intervening in foreign affairs elsewhere to its own gain, or where there was quite a bit of hyperbole on how superb the Chinese investments were helping various countries around the world. And the truth, as is often the case, is somewhere in between these extremes. And I think a lot of the recent research has shown that the nuance, that quite a bit of nuance is needed in order to understand what is really going on. And so we're contributing to that kind of nuance, and we have a couple of things that we bring, I think, to the table. The first is that our researchers have been doing in-depth empirical studies over the course of the last year. That has meant detailed field work, interviews with various stakeholders, and in-depth policy analyses, which we're now seeing come together in these various papers. The other part, or the other contribution that we're making, is to take a global outlook. The Belt and Road Initiative, starting as much of a regional initiative as the or the Belt and the Road, the overland Silk Roads, as it were, plus the maritime Silk Roads have expanded to such an extent that they now effectively span the entire globe. So we are taking a look from a bird's eye perspective, and we have several contributions that will look at, for example, China and the BRI in specific regions like Latin America, various places around Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and so on. So that's the global outlook. But at the same time, we're also providing local reality checks. So we have a number of contributions that will focus on case studies, and that can mean both case studies in specific countries or particular regions, but also cases of particular institutions or particular policy fields in which the BRI plays out. So these are the ways in which we're trying to complicate the discussion and look at it from various angles. And in doing so, we're trying to avoid what is sometimes called methodological nationalism. So we're trying to get away from a perspective where the main actors are the nation states and where China is acting and India is reacting and so on. That can be a useful language as a shorthand for understanding international politics, but it doesn't give us the whole picture. So what we have asked our contributors to do is to reflect on who the actors, who the agents actually are in these processes that involve China's BRI. And in that context, I think we are now seeing a couple of types of agency and of treatments of the idea of actors and agents emerge from this different work. So one is that it's important to focus on the details. Details matter. So who is actually doing what in the context of the BRI? And just to give you an example from scholarship that we won't hear about tonight, but which will be in the final publication, we have colleagues who've been working on how China or the People's Republic of China has been engaging in trade, taxation, and finance regimes in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. And they have found that depending on what policy field you look at, you get different actors on the Chinese side pushing for different kinds of interests. So sometimes these actors are interested in strategic issues that promote, for example, geopolitical interests. In other cases, they're interested in efficiency markers and how to get particular initiatives off the ground in a cost-effective way. And sometimes these two motives balance each other out. So you get very diverse approaches to what the BRI can mean depending on where you look. And then there's a question of power. Who actually gets to act? And we're going to hear later from Stacey Links, who is focusing on Africa, to show us what it actually means when actors from an African context, from African countries, engage with the BRI on their own terms and make their own demands and negotiate in certain ways. So these are the kind of issues that we are trying to add to the discussion by focusing specifically on agency.
Okay, thank you. Now, notwithstanding the wide variety of the issues that we've been looking at, could you say something about what this study tells about the achievements and the goals and the backlash of the BRI after 7 years?
Yes, I think some of the early years of BRI, as I already mentioned, were accompanied by relatively simple understandings of what was going on. Some of these understandings are not necessarily wrong. We've seen quite a few problems accompany the BRI projects. There's a number of downsides. One have been loans that have at times been ill-advised. There's been much talk about whether there's a risk of creating debt and debt traps for particular partners of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And there's been a very serious concern about environmental impact of many of these projects. And these are just three concerns. I could name more, like concerns about human security issues, health, safety, rights, and equality. So ultimately, the question remains, who actually benefits from individual Belt and Road projects? But I think what our research now also shows is that these problems are indeed, they're real, but they're multivariate. There's a number of different layers to these issues, and there's often Chinese actors who are themselves very keenly aware of the risks that are involved in rolling out this massive infrastructure project and economic collaboration project, which is supposed to, by 2049, have involved $1 trillion. And that is significantly more than the Netherlands produces in terms of GDP in an entire year. So that's the kind of scope that we're talking about. And so it becomes very complex very quickly. And I think we're now seeing Again, not just a maturation of the debates around the BRI, but also a much more mature approach to these various kinds of projects. For instance, projects that try to be more sustainable in terms of sustainable development, so ecologically more green. A stronger focus, not just on the infrastructure projects, which can be a very quick and easy way to promote economic growth if you're thinking of Keynes and Keynesian economics, but they don't necessarily are sustainable or have long-lasting positive effects. So the refocus has been on education, on science, on technology, on issues of health, particularly now in the wake of the coronavirus crisis. So we see a much more focused approach to BRI projects that promises to also then be more stable, or at least concerns itself more with the goal of being more stable and more secure in terms of its lending. So I think one of the big things we can take away from this research is that this has been an immense networking exercise on the part of the Chinese government and its many various partners, including state-owned enterprises, private enterprises, and that Chinese actors are now positioning themselves at the core of complex networks inside the corridors, the economic, financial, information flow corridors that we're seeing developing around the world.
Okay, thank you very much for this comprehensive introduction. Stay with us because we'll be back to you for the Q&A and then finally also for the conclusions. In the meantime, I welcome my colleague Ingrid from Leiden University. She's also a researcher at Klingendael and naturally also with LeidenAsiaCentre. Ingrid, as we just seen, your chapter is on higher education cooperation by the Chinese, focusing of course on the BRI, but it fits into the wider context of quite a lot of concern on the soft power reigned by China. Could you say a few words about that context for us?
Yeah, and indeed, Lily, you see that BRI is many things, but it's also a project for China to build its soft power. The Chinese story from the beginning has been, this is the project of the century for China. This is our gift to the world with our investments in infrastructure. We spur economic development, we increase connectivity, and that is a story that's very strongly promoted. It's promoted in soft power and public diplomacy campaigns, for example, in speeches of all leaders. In many cultural programs, you have BRI concerts, BRI ballets, BRI essay contests for high school children. The Confucius Institutes are promoting the BRI, and so on. But more importantly, also for our book and our project, what China wants to do is to mainstream the BRI into all policy domains. And in the book we see that, I think, in several case study chapters, but we also see it in the more thematic chapters. For example, the chapter by Jai Wang, Mike Simpson, and Irma Mosquera Valderrama. They write about tax and finance legislation and how this supports the BRI. And you see that also in my chapter, which is about the nexus between the BRI and higher education and science research. And what they aim for, the Chinese government, the pattern, so to say, is to have a symbiotic relationship, to have the policy domain support the BRI, and to have all the BRI projects support the policy domain. And if I make that more concrete, for example, in higher education, you see that all these BRI educational projects help China to accelerate its modernization efforts in the area of higher education, to improve the quality of education because there is more mobility. There's a higher demand for quality education in China. You see that it helps China to strengthen its internationalization of higher education, the expansion of international cooperation, increasing mobility, especially incoming mobility. You see that it supports China's goal to strengthen international global education governance. And last but not least, China uses this to position itself as a country that exports knowledge and higher education institutions. And they do that, for example, a lot in BRI countries with vocational institutions, so institutions for vocational training.
And how do these efforts support or strengthen the BRI initiative locally, especially in terms of these vocational training institutes?
Yeah, what I found in my research is that China, especially in Asian BRI countries, it establishes many vocational institutions to train locally people in skills, in technical skills, in engineering, and these local students of this young pool of newly educated people, they are going to work in Chinese enterprises involved at local BRI projects. So there is a huge need for young talents to implement all these BRI projects, and higher education internationalization is helping this effort in this way. And I know that they also, I haven't looked into that, but maybe later on Stacey Links can say something about it. China is also exporting a lot of vocational training to African countries, and I can imagine it's working there the same, that it helps local people to find jobs in Chinese enterprises working for the BRI.
Okay. Apart from the BRI countries, Chinese higher education is also very much engaged in exchange with non-BRI countries. It used to be, the United States and Australia used to be in the forefront of these countries. That might perhaps no longer be the case. What did you find about that?
Well, the effect of the BRI on their relationship is, of course, China wants more than just BRI goals with its internationalization. China wants to become a knowledge economy, a leader in higher education in science and technology. And that is not something they can develop per se with BRI countries, because in general these are less developed countries. So they still need the cooperation with advanced countries like the US, like Australia, like Europe. So China still likes to invest in that very much. What you see in general, and that's for all over the world, China is becoming more attractive because it's improving the quality of its education, because it's giving all these scholarships for people to come to China to study there. But on the other hand, you also see that BRI is not always received very positively. It is raising concerns about China's political goals. In general, the academic climate in China is not developing in a positive direction. To the contrary, we have several cases of censorship. And then on top of that, with some countries, you mentioned US and Australia, there have been broader political tensions. So in the long term, this cooperation in higher education with the US, with Australia, may become more difficult. And that is, of course, even strengthened that development by COVID-19.
Yeah, on COVID-19, China was obviously one of the countries that profited most from the international educational exchange, as we have seen surging for about 20 years now. What do you think will be the impact of COVID-19 on ingoing and outgoing mobility in the People's Republic of China?
Well, in the short term, the consequences are very dramatic. I think that's true for all over the world, so there will not be much mobility in the coming year. Now, this can be different in 1 or 2 years when there is a vaccine against COVID-19, and then it may start up again, but it will take a few years to, of course, to recover. On the other hand, if you look at China's policy goals, they are on the long term, they are for 30, 40 years away, and then 1 or 2 years may only be a small glitch in the development. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we see that the whole COVID-19 episode is leading to a growing apprehension of countries about China in general, but also again about the BRI. We've also seen, for example, that China has, the Chinese government has set new regulations for sharing information, academic research information about the origin of the COVID-19 virus, and this shows to the world that China is infringing on academic freedom. So there are a lot of, let's say, more general concerns now tied to the COVID-19 pandemic and how China is behaving. So that's on the negative side. On the other side, some countries, they have benefited from China's COVID-19 diplomacy. China is helping out universities, educational institutions in some countries. So it may differ from place to place all over the world, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much for enlightening your research. We'll be back to you also in the questions and answer sessions. And I would now like to invite my colleague Stacey Links to the floor. And Ingrid will make place for Stacey Links, who is also a researcher at the LeidenAsiaCentre and a university teacher at Leiden University. Welcome, Stacey. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
You have done several things for us, like
Yes.
somebody else who we will interview later on, Matt Ferchen. You actually wrote two chapters, one on Africa in general and the other on the Southern Africa development cooperation. Community, sorry,
Yes.
development community. Together with Sanne van der Lucht, who wrote on the Digital Silk Road in Ethiopia, that will comprise the part in the book going about Africa, and we will now talk about Africa in general, and
Yes.
we'll leave the other two chapters aside. One of the things I think we should discuss is that the emphasis on Chinese investments and loan in Africa is very much from the point of view that serves the local parties, the countries in Africa, much better than 70 years of development aid by Western countries. What would be your take on that? Is that a truism or is it more nuanced?
I think, like Florian had mentioned earlier, in terms of the broader picture of Chinese engagement across the world, there's always going to be a lot more nuance, right? Within the field of China-Africa studies, so to speak, what we saw emerge initially, or how it kind of kick-started, was because there was a very binary idea on the West versus China. So a lot of the times when we speak about China and Africa, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is the West. And that's the kind of hidden comparison. Now, I often get asked the question about, well, what are the tangible results, for China in Africa, and what are these tangible results for Africa? I think because of China's strategies, because of the areas that China does invest in, these are areas that tend to be, again, much more long-term in terms of when will we see the returns on these investments. We won't see them in 2 years' time. We won't see them in 5 years' time. We will see them in 10, 20 years' time. So it's very difficult to make a kind of quantitative assessment of Chinese investments in Africa. I think in most cases, it's too early to tell. So in that regard, I don't think a tally of Western aid or Western investment, for that matter, in Africa versus Chinese investment is necessarily useful, always, because they are simply at different levels in terms of how new they are within the context of the continent. What you do see is you see more of a qualitative difference, I think, between Western and Chinese engagement. And this is largely to do with the areas that China is focused on, right? So infrastructure development. These are structural lacunas, structural gaps that have really impeded African development, African regional development, African continental development. And within the African economic landscape, the lack of investment in these areas, particularly from the West, has almost been seen as stifling African development. And here you get China that comes in and really complements the African agenda. And this is where you see a narrative emerging, or this idea emerging, that Chinese investment in Africa, and I must say here, to even speak of Chinese investment in such a broad sense is really generalizing. But if we take it as such, the areas within which China has put most of its efforts in, these are areas that have the potential to really have transformative power in terms of African development. The other aspect I think that really stands out is, and this is spoken about quite often, is conditionality. Mm-hmm. The West is known for having very conditional means with which it engages the developing world, and particularly Africa. And on the other hand, we have China, who obviously there are certain conditions attached to engagement with China, but it's not the same kind of conditionality that we see in the West. So, for example, the more prescriptive, paternalistic conditionality that we see coming from the West, that is fundamentally different to how China has engaged Africa. And now when we speak about agency, which is the real focus of my chapters and my contribution to this research project, and we look at the concept of agency, this lack of conditionality on the part of the Chinese actually, in a certain sense, provides more room for African agency. Mm-hmm. So one can also see Chinese engagement in Africa as an opportunity for African communities, states, actors to exercise more agency, because conditionality generally has the effect of constraining that room for maneuver. So China's engagement in Africa has, for all intents and purposes, provided an opportunity. Whether or not Africa uses this opportunity and to what extent it is used by states, by civil society, by various actors, remains to be seen, and for what purposes, right? But this also taps in to another aspect of agency, which is that agency is an attribute that can be held by any actor. We often think of agency as being very activist, very reactive, very anti, right? So you speak of agency. Does Africa have agency with regards to China? Well, generally when that question is asked, what underlies the assumption there, or what the underlying assumption is there agency insofar as African actors being counter to China initiatives? Whereas agency can actually be exercised, in what we see in the case of China and Africa, in a very complementary fashion. So when you have synergies in agendas, and when agendas are set in a very synergistic and overlapping way, agency is maybe not as easy to identify, but it is there. And Africans, I think, African actors drive the agenda more than what we give them credit for often.
Okay, well, this makes a very clear case for agency. Thank you very much. Still, I doubt whether it's all that rosy as you now ended up concluding.
Yes.
What is in the dynamism that you see in Africa locally? What are the voices that are not content with the Chinese involvement in the continent?
You know, when you speak, again, when we speak of the continent, we have to be so careful, because we do have, obviously, regional organizations and bodies such as the African Union that speak on a very continental level. But then we have the bilateral engagements with China. We have communities, right, that are affected by certain infrastructure deals or investments. We also have dissenting views, obviously, from local communities, right? Mm-hmm. And also there's a mix of politics involved in everything that China does in Africa. So certain countries, for example, it's probably the most well-known within China-Africa circles, but in Zambia, for example, the anti-Chinese sentiment is very strong. And that's from a governmental level, that's from a local level, because it does have a trickle-down effect. The news media has a very important role to play. Social media has a very important role to play in terms of the perceptions that people have in terms of Chinese investment on the continent or Chinese presence on the continent. And oftentimes what we see is that Western media also has a role in playing to either positive or negative ideas about China's role on the continent. In terms of the cases that we looked at within the context of this research, my colleague Sander van der Lucht, she looked at Ethiopia and she looked at the digital Silk Road. I looked at SADC, the Southern African Development Community, which is a regional body. And here you also see, massive differences. Because on the one hand, you are speaking about a state, Ethiopia. On the other hand, you're speaking about a regional body. So there are so many actors when we speak of Africa and dissenting views. So I think the important thing when we're trying to understand China in Africa is to disaggregate what is Africa. Who are the actors, who are the players, and what are they actually driven by, because sometimes it is for a next election, sometimes it is for developmental goals, Pan-African goals of intra-regional trade. So there are various actors, and I think in any of these questions to do with agency, we really need to unpack what are the agendas of these various actors, because this is a core concept that we deal with when we speak about agency, is agenda setting. So what is the agenda of a given actor? And is this actor able to set the agenda and steer the agenda insofar as their engagement with China? And this agenda can be complementary to Chinese initiatives within Africa, but they can also be combative, right? They can also be against or anti. So there really is a range of perceptions when we speak about China in Africa.
And do you see perceptions also operating transnational?
So from a regional perspective, I guess if we look at a regional body like SADC, what we see is SADC, I think, struggles in part because how it operates as a regional organization premised on member states, right? And not all of the member states are in agreement in their position with regards to China. So there, for example, SADC has challenges insofar as how it approaches China and to what degree it maybe initiates cooperation with China, because all the member states have to be in agreement with that.
Yeah.
So transnationally, I think because China also operates predominantly, and now I speak on a state level, predominantly on a bilateral basis in Africa, you don't see spillovers from state to state, let's say. But it really depends, I think, on the level of analysis, the history that country does have with China, and the local circumstances in terms of their agendas.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I have one question outside the scope of your research. Do you mind? No. Maybe you do, but you don't know yet. I was triggered when you explained the difference between the way the Chinese operate in Africa and the Western countries in a historical way. I mean, it's so obvious that the immense need of infrastructure, not only in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia, has been met with many of the Chinese BRI initiatives. How did this white spot among the Western countries develop within 70 years? I mean, it's so obvious. I mean, it's now more globalized than it was when the development aid started back in the 50s and 60s. But do you have an explanation for that?
I think, well, firstly, there are scholars that argue that, and practitioners that argue that infrastructure itself is not a very stable sector to invest in. So in terms of return on investment, infrastructure is not the top on the list. So there's that aspect, and tied to that, I think, over the years that the West has invested in Africa, they've invested from a very different starting point to China's starting point. As I mentioned earlier, I think there are complementary agendas between China and African states in terms of where they find themselves in the development ladder and how much they can actually gain from each other. The West, in a certain regard, has always almost been a little too far removed in their development trajectory. And so the very cliche win-win idea has, relatively speaking, I think there is more mutual interest between the agenda and the goals of China and African states than what there has ever been between Africa and the West.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting field for research, by the way, but that's quite another topic. Okay, thank you very much. Stay with us because we'll be back later for the Q&A. Thank you very much. Okay, now I call upon my colleague Matt Ferchen. No, sorry, Richard. Yeah, Richard Ghiasy, who is also here at Newsport, who will join us. Richard Ghiasy was looking at Pakistan and India. And hi, Richard.
Hi.
Good to have you here. And these are two very different cases, almost on the very end of the spectrum, in terms of the relationship with China. What would you say is the influence of BRI on the regional integration and on the geopolitical question?
Well, look, in terms of integration, by and large, the BRI has not been able to integrate South Asia more closely. There's been some improvements at the national and regional level, but so far it's been limited. However, the BRI has in South Asia, and elsewhere as well, by the way, South Asia is a very fragmented region, one of those most fragmented regions, and it has stimulated the region to connect. Mind you, India, the region's center and major power, has pursued disconnectivity policies for most of the last 70 years. They connected much more with the US, with Europe, with distant regions, but not with its own region. But since the BRI has been introduced, India has initiated quite a number of regional focused connectivity initiatives. Unfortunately, though, the BRI has also, let's say, intensified the historic tensions between China and Pakistan on the one hand and India on the other. It has also not been able to, let's say, narrow the rift between India and Pakistan. It has sustained it, although apparently the intention was from China to help narrow it. But mind you, these tensions, they all predate the BRI. So they're not necessarily brought upon or about by the BRI. But the BRI has done as well as it has further complicated and internationalized the region's geopolitics. That is to say, the US has grown more interested, the EU, Japan, Australia have all grown more interested in South Asia's security and connectivity. So in that sense, interestingly, the BRI has improved more so than intra-regional connectivity. It's improved connectivity with itself, with China thus far, but also with other regions. Now this said, smaller states in South Asia, so pretty much all of the states outside of India yearn for greater foreign investment. They yearn for greater connectivity. And in some cases, they long for a power balance, that is to say, less dependence on that major power, India. And that's where the BRI comes in, China comes in as an alternative, even if over the last 2-3 years, some of these states have become a little less enthusiastic about the BRI.
With the case of Pakistan, it has of course been a staunch ally to the United States. How do you see that relationship develop, given the interest China is showing in Pakistan and the very tangible projects it's doing there?
The relationship between Pakistan and the US?
Yeah.
Well, it's definitely not what it has been. It was quite strong also in the days of US presence, and it obviously is still present, but in Afghanistan, and the support that Pakistan provided. You could say that between the US and Pakistan, that specific US engagement in Afghanistan, the role that Pakistan played, the two have lost strategic trust in one another. And then China comes in, and China offers very pragmatic, very prudent, non-conditional support on a scale never seen before. These investments are, especially for regional standards, they're humongous. So Pakistan now is like, well, okay, India, we don't quite need you, we don't quite want you in terms of support, investment, aid. The US, we have an alternative, China, but obviously has created an overdependence on China for Pakistan, and such an overdependence, whether it is China, whether the overdependence is on the EU or the US, over the long term is not healthy. But for now, it's bringing in investment, it brings in jobs. So for now, obviously, it's very welcome.
Yeah. We discussed the agency matter with respect to Africa. What kind of reactions see you develop in South Asia, especially in India and Pakistan, with respect to the Chinese engagement?
Well, if we define agency in this context as the ability to influence or resist influence, India's case is nuanced because on the one hand, you now have this very powerful actor, China, with deep pockets, moves very quickly, has the technical ability, the diplomatic ability, comes in what you as India perceive as your sphere of influence, and buzzes around and pokes around and is quite effective. So India's agency in that sense has deteriorated somewhat. On the other hand, for the reason I mentioned before, that India had neglected its own region for so many decades. And now all of a sudden, well, wait a minute, our security, India's security, depends on how secure and affluent our neighbors are, and the extent to which we're connected with them. So India's agency has both deteriorated as well as improved. Pakistan specifically, yes, Pakistan is very much dependent on China now. But China at the same time also needs Pakistan. Look, South Asia is very interesting from a BRI perspective because it's a region where the maritime Silk Road and the Silk Road economic belt connect. That's where the synergies really take place. But also Pakistan, if you consider Myanmar being part of Southeast Asia, Pakistan is the only place in South Asia where China can directly, without trespassing a third country, access the Indian Ocean. And China has tremendous strategic interests in the Indian Ocean, supply lines, energy lines. So they are both very much dependent on each other. Pakistan has the geography, so to speak, and China has the deep pockets. If you look at smaller states, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, Bangladesh, their agency, on balance, I would say, has improved. Why? Because China is now a new supplier / investor, but also the US come in, EU, more interested, Japan, Australia. So they have a larger pool of actors to choose from.
And how would that compare with the general idea in Southeast Asia when it comes to agency and profiting from the Chinese involvement?
Well, there are some similarities between South Asia and Southeast Asia, but there's also some remarkable differences. I'll start with the differences first. South Asia's geography, its geographic reality, is very distinct from almost every other region in the world. India is literally and figuratively the heart of the region. It sits right at the center. It's also a neighbor of every other continental South Asian state, with the exception of Afghanistan. Now, interestingly, China, some might think it sits far, but China is also a neighbor to all South Asian continental states, with the exception of Bangladesh. And the space between the borders of these two countries isn't that big either. Now, that centrality of India, you don't have in Southeast Asia. There's no state that really sits at the heart and has been historically and still is so dominant. So that's the first real difference. The second real difference is the animosity between India and Pakistan, both nuclear armed, armed to the teeth, great levels of strategic distrust. There are no two such actors with that level of animosity in Southeast Asia, and that as a result of that have such a large impact on regional integration. If you look at SAARC, the regional cooperation body for South Asia, and you compare that to ASEAN and their, well, effectiveness, it's a world apart. Third is India's strategic distrust at the policy level, at the military level, and to some extent at the academic level of China. That level of distrust you have in Southeast Asia. The closest example would be Vietnam. But Vietnam then doesn't have that weight of India in its region. It doesn't have the centrality of India in its region. So that's what really sets South Asia apart from Southeast Asia. But if you look at similarities, Cambodia is probably the closest country that resembles Pakistan in South Asia, as in being very welcoming to Chinese engagement and Chinese BRI investments. Vietnam, as mentioned, the closest you'd get to an actor such as India in Southeast Asia, great strategic distrust of China. Other similarities are some of the states, not necessarily smaller in Southeast Asia, but Indonesia, Malaysia, have become a little bit more wary, a little bit more cautious as it relates to BRI investments. You see that same thing in South Asia, where the Maldives and Sri Lanka, for instance, have also grown more cautious.
Does China ever express itself about the tensions between India and Pakistan? I mean, this was obviously before China and India got entangled in another conflict. But how do they deal with it? Because these are two neighboring countries. They're at odds with each other, and China is getting a bigger and bigger factor in the region. I mean, do they ever refer to the tensions between Pakistan or India, or do they choose the diplomatic stance and stay away from it, which I guess would be the best thing to do? But
I hear different stories. Apparently China was very much hoping that the BRI would narrow this rift between India and Pakistan, that India would say, well, look, indeed, it makes so much sense, this BRI. You know, we'll jump on the bandwagon, and the issues we have with Pakistan will have economic rationale prevail over, you know, this political mindset and animosity. That definitely has not materialized.
No, not really.
India is generally, it says, well, look, if we look at the BRI, we don't see the economic rationale. We look at your investments in Pakistan, and they don't make a lot of economic sense to us. They make strategic sense and security sense, but not economic. the initiative is not really multilateral. It's unilateral and bilateral at best. And the initiative is not transparent. Why should we engage? Now, because both Pakistan and India sit on these extremes in terms of their perspective on the BRI, China has generally taken a step back. As you may remember at the beginning, but not only in South Asia, China was BRI, sell, 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 take. And then they learned, well, you know, maybe we shouldn't push it. If it's really that good, it's going to sell itself. So it's decided to do a bit of that policy in South Asia as well. But the historic tensions between India and Pakistan, and to an extent also Pakistan and Afghanistan, these are not bridges that China and the BRI can easily build.
Yeah. I think in all modesty, that is the right conclusion. Okay, thank you very much. Stay with us for the Q&A session. And in the meanwhile, we will call on Berlin, where our colleague Matt Ferchen is now being visible, I hope. I think so. Yes? Matt, are you there? Yes, Matt is there. Okay, very nice. Matt, we asked you to do two things as well. One was on Southeast Asia, on which Richard has already said a few things, but we're not going into that because he also wrote a general chapter on Latin America, new wine in old bottles. So that is what we're going to talk about right now. Matt, we would like to know from you that if people think of BRI, they will not automatically think about Latin America, I guess. They would think about Southeast Asia foremost. But there is also a lot going on in terms of Chinese investment loans and other projects in Latin America. What do you think, after having studied both these regions, is more striking? The differences in the Chinese approach towards these two regions or the resemblances?
Great, well, glad to be here with you all. But let me take a crack at the differences first. I think when we can take a geographic frame of reference, first of all, it's fairly clear that Southeast Asia occupies a much more central focus in terms of the geographic focus of the BRI compared to Latin America. There's a diversity and an intensity of economic, political relations, including in the BRI, in the Southeast Asia context. A lot of what I talk about in my Southeast Asia focused chapter is about this diversity of interactions between China and Southeast Asian countries, both sort of state-driven, but also a lot of activity which is informal, below the radar screen that we don't necessarily hear about. But there's this sort of the scope, the intensity of China, Southeast Asia, BRI interactions is very clear. The fact that Xi Jinping announced at least the maritime component of the BRI on a visit to Indonesia, both the continental and the maritime components have Southeast Asia as a central component. That's just different in the case of Latin America. That's sort of obvious, but this geographic difference is big, and it's been there for quite some time in terms of the Chinese relationship with Latin America. In terms of the BRI, then there's a timing issue as well. Again, Southeast Asia was on the ground, so to speak, when it came to the announcement of the BRI, the centrality of the BRI. The BRI really only came to Latin America and the Caribbean in 2017. For quite some time, if you talk to Chinese scholars or government officials, they would deny that there was really any room whatsoever for Latin America in the scope of the BRI. And this sort of makes sense. If you think about some of those maps that you see of the BRI, they focus, there's some overlay there, at least in some sort of historical imagination, of the classic ancient Silk Road. Latin America just doesn't fit there, right? So there's this geographic distance which also separates and is a big difference with the Latin America component of this. Similarities, though, I think this might be a little bit more surprising. On the one hand, there is this development focus. The BRI is about development as a framework. China is selling the idea of development, claiming that China is an agent and leader of development. And it's very keen on this message in the Latin American context, just as it is in Southeast Asia. There's also infrastructure at the core of the BRI in both regions. And so this is a key selling point as China belatedly has brought the BRI to Latin America. But also on the sort of problem side of things, you see concerns about Chinese investment in infrastructure, but also other areas, especially commodity-based. In the Latin America context, environmental concerns, labor concerns, local community engagement. You see these kinds of discussions. I'm often struck when I'm with civil society groups, academics, and government officials in a Latin America context. You hear really similar discussions about some of these concerns, also in a Southeast Asian context, and I think in an African context too. So there are some striking similarities given these geographic and time differences, and so I think just the act of the comparison is a useful thing to do, and there's actually not enough of that kind of comparison done, I think, and this is one of the insights from the project.
Okay, thank you. Now, you wrote a general chapter on Latin America, and our colleague Ruben Vicente Gonzalez wrote a chapter on the Caribbean, which you're also familiar with. If you look at the motives of China to get so heavily engaged in that particular region, but also in Latin America in general, are these motives primarily economically, politically, a combination of the two? Can you say something about what projects are the most successful given they have an economic driver compared to a political driver? Is something to be said about that?
Yeah, well, this is a great question, and I think it's really important to note these regional distinction, and Ruben's focus on the Caribbean really highlights some of this. Let me begin with sort of this a historical, or you might call it a historical take on these distinctions between economic and political drivers. A big part of my chapter is devoted to the pre-BRI era, which I think makes some sense given that, again, the BRI wasn't really extended to the region until 2017. On the economic side, it's very clear that commodities and commodity exports from South America played a key role in the period between 2003 and 2013. So exports of minerals like copper and iron ore, of agricultural commodities like soy in particular, and then energy, oil, were really key. And again, South American countries dominated in this sense. So pre-2017, really beginning around the turn of the millennium, we saw this takeoff in exports of raw materials from South America. So there's a real economic component to that. But on top of that, there was a real burst in diplomatic activity that corresponded with a lot of that economic activity. So all of a sudden in the period between 2003 and 2010, a lot of countries, again in South America, saw themselves have China become their number one or number two trade partner, again, focused on commodities. But on top of that, there was a lot of diplomatic interaction. So high-level state-to-state visits between Chinese leaders and Latin American leaders. Now, big differences in this period of time were in the Caribbean and in Mexico that didn't have the commodities that the South American countries did. So there was always a sort of looking at what the drivers were economically and politically for Caribbean countries and for Mexico. And there was a fair amount of frustration there. I'd say this turned after 2013, after the end of the commodity boom, this is really when the BRI and the idea of more Chinese investment and investment in infrastructure really started to take hold, especially in regions that really hadn't benefited from the commodity boom. And this is where we see some of the focus then in the Caribbean, Central America in particular. In the last few years, a lot more Chinese activity in the building of transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and to a certain extent, digital infrastructure, both in the Caribbean, Central America, and in South America. So the BRI as a kind of complement or supplement to the post-commodity boom era in the region. And it's a real mix of both economic and political drivers. China always wanted the best of both worlds, and certainly countries in the region did as well. That hasn't always turned out to be such a win-win story in a lot of cases.
Well, in terms of advocacy, let's get back to that. Do you think that the Chinese and involvement in Latin America and in the Caribbean did help those two regions to get closer to the development goals that they had set for themselves?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's a question I think that people, again, governments, multilateral institutions, civil society groups in the region have been asking themselves since this sort of outburst of the relationship with China, again, pre-BRI, but BRI and its extension to the region has brought it all up again. What does the involvement with China mean for development in the region? And this is a real focus of Ruben's work, and he paints a nuanced picture here. On the one hand, China is a new and in many ways needed and wanted partner for infrastructure development, for a variety of kinds of commercial engagement with the region that had relatively few alternatives. We see the similar discussion in South America too, the idea of China as a new alternative trade partner and diplomatic partner. That said, a lot of the activities, again, the sort of commodity-focused activities, the infrastructure activities, they tend to reproduce historical patterns which don't necessarily bring the region, whether that's the Caribbean, Central America, or South America, out of some of those difficulties that they've had for a long time, commodity dependency, but what's going to be the real driver of development in the region? And I think in a lot of ways, China has overpromised and underdelivered on this. This goes back to the question of agency as well. So what were the expectations on the side of host countries? Were they realistic or not? I would say in general, China has taken it for granted that development is part of the picture, that just doing commodity-based trade or building infrastructure that by Chinese definitions is development. This is questioned by many counterparts in Latin America and the Caribbean. The region has done as much or more thinking among scholars and multilateral institutions about what is development, what is the nature of equality in development, and does China really bring something new there? I would say there's still a kind of optimistic view in the region, but also over time, it's been tempered by a bit more realism that, yeah, China's a major new partner, but it's probably not going to be a cure-all for the region's development needs.
Okay. Clear and straightforward answer. Thank you very much. Stay with us because we will now start with the Q&A session. And if my colleagues could bring their own chair because they're sitting outside what you can see outside of the reach of the cameras, but they will be right here. Okay, Stacey and Ingrid, and this is all within a 1.5 meter distance setting, as you can imagine. Okay. Good, great. Okay, now the people watching us from home, they probably have started to ask questions. Yes, I can see the questions popping up there at the screen in the very end. If you are watching and you like a certain question, you can upvote that, like that, to speak in social media terms, and then the question will get higher in the hierarchy. Yes, we're getting a lot of questions in, but in the meantime, let me ask the researchers here around the table all, the three of you. Don't look at the questions all the time, stay focused. Let me ask you the question. You have been working on this for about a year. You all did extensive field work. Still in the pre-corona time, you did a lot of desktop research. The topics that you researched are close to your heart. So could you very briefly state what was it that has surprised you most during your not during your research, but in your findings? Richard, since you're the only male around the table, let me start with you.
Sure. I think what surprised me the most is the extent to which, as a regional actor, specifically in this case referring to India, the extent to which you need deep pockets, diplomatic capacity, administrative and technical capacity to be able to counter the BRI in your own region, even if you sit right at its heart, even if you have that weight. But it's so indicative of how much pull the BRI has and how hard it is to counter it, even in your own region, for an actor as major as India.
Okay, clear, thank you. We might come back to that later in the discussion. Stacey.
Yeah, I think I will speak to my case chapter on SADC, and just to reiterate again, that's the Southern African Development Community. Prior to the research, I had talked to many other experts in the field, and just kind of gauging their views on SADC and China relations, let alone the BRI, because SADC is obviously quite far removed from that geographic map of the BRI that we all have. And I think there was a lot of the sentiment was that SADC was not really interested, wasn't really doing much, wasn't very active. As a body, it doesn't have, a lot of teeth in that sense. But also SADC is traditionally seen as very close to Europe in terms of financing and support. So nothing was really known, actually, about SADC and China and the BRI. So many of the responses I got from people when I told them that this is what I was doing was good luck. So the surprising thing, firstly, was that I managed to actually get research on the topic. But then also, more importantly, was that SADC had and was in the process, actually, of signing their MOU with China during the time of the research. So experts that I spoke to about and interviewed, they weren't even aware that there was an MOU. And during the course of my research, that came up, and it was actually formally signed. And so I got a lot of inside information into SADC's drive for cooperation with China. And what was interesting about it was that the push really came from SADC and not from China, in the way that I think a lot of people would have assumed.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice, thank you. Okay, Ingrid.
Yeah, actually two things. And the first is that the extent to which the Chinese government makes the connection between the BRI and higher education. And how the Chinese government makes it work, this connection. It's really symbiotic. So BRI projects really help China develop, internationalize, modernize its education, its higher education. And the other way around, how international cooperation on higher education really helps BRI forward. And before we talked about how higher education trains the talents that the BRI needs, but higher education also helps promote the BRI and make it a household name all over the world. So that's the first thing that really surprised me. The second one, maybe not so much a surprise, but in the end, I hadn't expected it was to such a big extent that agency in China in making this connection really lies with state organs. So Communist Party and the government institutions, also at provincial level. And yes, of course, the universities, the institutions do have a role, but they are merely implementing and translating the policies into practical projects. And it's not bottom-up. They do this because they're pushed by the government. They have to answer the call of the government to do something with the BRI, and they are pulled by financial incentives by the government. So these are the two main surprising findings.
Okay, clear. Okay, now then let me get to the questions of the audience. And there was one which is now receiving less support than it used to be, but I'm still going to ask that question because it also touches on what you were saying. Now, the BRI has become a container notion in many ways. And the question by Bert van der Heuvel, everybody can see that online, I guess, but I will read it out nevertheless. Is it a smart soft power move by Beijing to label many of China's international activities using one prominent term, BRI, or does that attract more scrutiny? Good. Well, maybe we will also make use of the fact that Florian and Matt are still with us. Matt, would you be able to answer that particular question?
Oh, that's a tricky one. We had this discussion in Singapore when we all met in January. I think China, on the one hand, has had some success in the sort of open-ended nature of the BRI. It's certainly, as a marketing campaign, doing quite well. Certainly on people's tongues more than, like America's Blue Dot Network, and certainly the EU connectivity strategy. Maybe it goes to a sort of marketing power in the term. But on the other hand, because it's become a little bit of everything, it's a little bit too easy then to criticize if almost every activity that isn't really even under the control of the central government or provincial governments in China is associated with the BRI. It's much more difficult for China to do risk management on any given sort of proper evaluation of a project or reputationally. So on the one hand, there's this name recognition and sort of a PR element that goes a long way. On the other hand, it's really got no constraints, and in this way has also become a focal point for critics of everything that China does. You just look at the BRI, and certainly this is something that U.S. policymakers have focused in on, debt trap diplomacy and such. So it's really a two-edged sword. I think Chinese officials are aware that the cat's out of the bag a little bit and that there needs to be some discipline brought to it, but it's easier said than done.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone here around the table who really would like to react on that? Ingrid?
Yeah, maybe briefly. I think one of the reasons that everything is labeled BRI is because it comes with money. So as soon as an actor labels a project BRI, it's easier to get funding from the Chinese government. So that's one of the reasons they do it. Another one, of course, is indeed promotion, and this has been quite successful because BRI is now very well known around the world. In some cases, what I see in higher education is that China pushes, for example, European universities to accept that label, and that is often not very successful because universities, they want to cooperate because it's academically beneficial, and they don't care about the label.
Yeah, and what about the second part of the question? The fact that it's recognizable as one initiative is also partly responsible for the pushback that we notice now. I mean, I think that we would all agree on that, Ingrid?
Yeah, and I think in the beginning it has been very successful for China to put everything together on a one big BRI umbrella, because that helped, to get known as an incentive, but also it helped to get all the finances together and to raise the fundings herefor. But now you see the contrary, it's pushing back. So I think initially it has been successful. I think now China is also reconsidering this, by the way. I think they are becoming more careful about what to label BRI and what not to label BRI.
Okay, clear, thank you. Then there is an anonymous question. Most of the questions are anonymous. We don't hold you responsible for that. And I think it might be directed to Richard, because it's, how important is regional and local stability for China, and how likely is China to defend its interest by actually intervening within this region? The last one is a tricky one, and the second one, the first part you already answered, that China has given up the ambition to be a stabilizer between India and Pakistan. But would it also go for the larger region?
Well, China's definitely very interested because it affects not only the image of the BRI, but also itself. And it has grown very cautious about its image. It's become much more proactive in how it tries to steer and nuance this image. So the importance is absolutely there. Now, in the specific case of India and Pakistan, indeed, China has become less active, isn't necessarily doing that much. But if you look, for instance, at the national level in Pakistan, southernmost province, large one, Balochistan, that's where Gwadar port is located, very important to the BRI. But there was local resistance. Some of the locals felt that they weren't engaged enough, and there was some violent expressions of their discontent. So China invited some of their leaders, engaged with them, talked to them, and said, well, look, how can we engage you? What is important to you? Why do you feel left out? What can we do? Other cases also in Pakistan include more of in its central, northwestern areas, certain terrorist attacks, Chinese engineers killed or hurt, where China said, well, look, this affects progress, and sat down with Islamabad and said, well, look, we need protection, not only for our workers, for your workers too, but these investments are of a joint interest. So you see that the China, when it can and when it's really important, it does step in, absolutely.
Okay. Do we know likewise cases in Africa, Stacey?
I would say that at least in terms of the official Chinese discourse and how much is focused on the issue of peace and security in the African context, it is something that is reiterated by Chinese officials as having a very close relationship with development. On the one hand, they're kind of seen to be interlinked, right? So you need development in order to secure peace and in order to maintain regional stability. On the other hand, regional instability presents problems, obviously, for development initiatives. But, you know, within Africa, China's definitely, I think, although there has been mention of peace and security in this more conceptual framework, I think it very much keeps its distance, at least publicly so, from meddling, one would say. Yeah. So when it comes to Africa, this idea of regional instability and conflict is very much aligned with politics. And so China would rather take a step back from that, at least in a public domain, and focused on development.
Sick.
Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. Then the next question, well, that is, I think, I know the answer already, but I nevertheless have to read it aloud. Do you think European science understands contemporary China enough? Where do you see the gaps in expertise and research gaps? Ingrid, that is clearly a question for you.
That's a very, very broad question. Let me say, in general, higher education institutions, and I'm talking now mainly about Europe, that's what I know most about, they do not sufficiently know China. Of course, there are many China experts who know China very well, but I'm now speaking in general. For example, people who are working with China in the STEM direction, or in engineering, they usually only know, well, a few people they work with in China, maybe they've been there once or twice, but they do not understand the Chinese academic system. And I think I want to keep it to this one. I think that's the biggest gap. I think we need a better understanding of China's academic system, its goal, how it works, how it's financed, and its links with other parts of China, and specifically defense organizations.
Okay, okay, thank you. Now we get to very interesting questions. No, the ones we had before. Could I see the ones before? Yeah. How political is your research? Now, I think that's a very good question. Florian, are you still with us? I guess so. I mean, I can't see you right now. Florian?
No, I'm still here, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, good. Is this a question that you could take? How political is our research?
It's difficult because I'm not entirely sure what our asker, the person who submitted the question, means by political. So are we talking about on a political spectrum, left and right, whether we're taking political positions? I think all research is political. So I would have a very hard time to make a case for objective research. I don't think there's such a thing, not in the social sciences. In terms of whether there's a political position that emerges from these different papers, I don't think there is a singular one, and that the book in that way is slanted in a particular direction, because we have between all these nuanced positions, we have everything from critical commentary of what doesn't work and where we should be wary, all the way to interventions on the side of saying we should also be very careful not to reproduce infamous China threat stories, which are very popular in the media and sometimes creep into academic work and policy advice as well. So we have to find a position that is much more careful than that. So I don't know if that counts as political. I think there is plenty of criticism in the book of already established institutions, for example, of how European and American actors have behaved in various policy and political contexts, and how it is very easy to now criticize the Chinese government and the Chinese state for effectively emulating and in some case trying to revamp the situation that it is finding itself in. Chinese actions don't happen in a vacuum. They pick up on what IMF, World Bank, and other institutions have been doing for some time, what European actors, for example, have been doing in African contexts or Latin American contexts for a long time. So the Chinese state is now an actor that is playing in these various games and has to find its own position. Often it finds positions that are worth criticizing, but we should always see these positions then also in context. So maybe that answers the question in terms of us also being a little bit political about our research.
Okay, thank you. Stacey would like to say something on this.
Just on the issue of being political, I know I mentioned it earlier, but with the question of agency, there is a tendency to view agency in a very normative light. Certain agents using their agency is seen as a normative good, and other agents exercising their agency is seen as a normative bad. So I think, you know, even within the context of that work, and my research on that work, I specifically took the view that I would treat agency as a normative neutral. As a researcher, it's not my job to do the judging, so to speak, on that. But I think when we speak of things like agency, we have to be very self-aware of what normative judgments we are imbuing on that concept. And I think a lot of the times in discussions of agency, you see a lot of the underlying assumptions of this idea of China in Africa, or the China threats, or tropes of Africa as corrupt or necessarily the victim. So I think when we have these discussions in terms of how political they are, as researchers, we try to kind of step aside from that, or at least within my work, I tried that. But yeah, to be aware that sometimes even these terms that we use that we think are very neutral are in fact very political.
Okay, thank you. Another question disappeared now from the top 3, and that was a question linked to this, namely what if we know if what the People's Republic of China thinks of our research. And now we're going back to the top questions, but I would like to make use of this opportunity to state that the LeidenAsiaCentre research is done completely independent because we have our own financial means. So we are not paid either by the United Front or by the CIA, just to make things clear if that is a problem to some people. Apparently, somehow the discussion triggered quite a lot of questions on this political thing, which I think is good, and maybe we should take it one day as a separate issue to discuss. But now the top question, the top rating question, is a very interesting one, and I think it can be answered by almost everybody around the table, and that is to what extent China is repeating its own development experience from the second half of the 20th century by choosing investment in, for example, infrastructure. I think it's a very relevant question. Maybe we should turn to Matt first for giving an answer.
Well, sure. I think we absolutely see some elements, say infrastructure. The way that China is selling the story that infrastructure, again, transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, digital infrastructure, that these were key components of China's own development story, and that they are then going to be good for other countries' development. We see this absolutely. I think there's a lot of problems with that story, however, part of which is that there is an acritical view of this within the history of China's own development experience. Building big dam projects, urbanization is a deeply dislocating social economic process. There was never any agreement within the community, the research community on development economics in China, that infrastructure was like this key part of China's own development experience. I think intuitively it makes some sense. You know, it's nice to have high-speed trains that work. It's nice to have highways that work. Nice to have airports, new airports. And as you know, as you look at other parts of the world that don't have these things, it's sort of intuitive. But Lily, I think this goes to your earlier question too of what happened to Western development finance institutions like the World Bank. Well, they had a lot of experience with building big infrastructure projects like dams in the 1960s. And there were a lot of problems with those, and there were decisions made about why not to finance those sorts of things. So this is just to say that China has absolutely hit on the idea that infrastructure was a key component of its own development experience. It's going to be great for everyone else. This is the story it's selling. There were always challenges and problems with that on the domestic side of things. There are equally or more challenges on selling that internationally. Not to say that better infrastructure won't be good for many people. It's just that this tends to be a sort of point of view that is acritically promoted from many on the Chinese side.
Thank you, Matt. Stacey, this might be one you want to take.
Yeah, I think at least within the African development paradigm, infrastructure remains a very key component through which we understand development and development potential. And because it has been labeled as one of the huge impediments to our development, to this day, I mean, if we just look at the size of the African continent, and the fact that if you want to fly from Cape Town to Morocco, you need to fly via Paris, and Europe remains your interlocutor, you know, this is a huge issue for intra-regional trade. And so I don't think you can underestimate it. Is it the only factor? No, of course not. But I do think that from the developing world and the African perspective, I mean, the infrastructure, the lack of infrastructure really impedes our ability to trade within our states, let alone regionally. So yeah, so I you know, definitely China, is it replicating its own experience? For sure. One of the most notable China-Africa scholars, Deborah Browdingham, always mentions the story about how Japan actually did, you know, what a lot, very similarly to what China is now doing in Africa. So they learned from their own experience and are now potentially replicating that. But I don't think that that's a secret.
Or a problem.
Or a problem.
Or a problem, for that matter.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, good. Thank you very much. We have more questions, but we're running out of time. And I know the span of attention for online viewers is limited to 14 minutes, so we are long overdue. And we still have a conclusion ahead of us, which will be provided by Florian Schneider. Florian, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And let me first of all thank all of our speakers for joining us tonight, and our audience at home for sticking with us for so long. If you're in the Netherlands or somewhere in Europe, you are currently witnessing one of the wonderful, nicest summer days we've had in a very long time, and you're here with us watching us talk. So thank you for that. I wanted to briefly highlight a couple of findings, maybe two central core conclusions that we're currently drawing from these various projects. Overall, I think it's important to understand that a lot is hiding behind the banner of the new Silk Roads, right? So this whole imagination of Silk Roads, whether they're via land or the maritime routes, is now becoming a metaphor for complex network interactions that don't necessarily condense down to one singular thing. And maybe that's one of the major themes then, that there isn't such a thing as a monolithic single answer to what we're seeing happening right now. And that also means we need to be very conscious of the fact that China is not one single monolithic actor in its own right. It is not just the PRC, the government itself, that is acting. It is often various state-owned enterprises, various private enterprises. Ingrid pointed out how a whole lot of different partners, whether they're Chinese or located elsewhere, like to slap on the label of the BRI in order to make themselves more viable for funding or more attractive for funding. So a lot happens under this broader framework, in many cases involving actors with very different interests. And so we need to take a look at what actually happens on the ground in specific instances. And while we are providing, I think, 12 very exciting chapters on how that works, I think there's going to be plenty of room until the project runs its course in 2049 to keep digging into the various complexities of this topic. The other issue that our research, I think, has shown matters a great deal is domestic actors in partner countries, so domestic elites in particular. Stacey has pointed out how various actors in African countries are often engaged in encouraging BRI projects or bringing BRI projects to their own localities, and that agency doesn't always have to mean challenging something, but can also mean acting on your own behalf together with partners. This is something that we need to acknowledge and take seriously. At the same time, I think there's also a need to ask who are these actors that are actually working on the behalf of. Elites tend to style themselves as representative of various constituencies, but at the end of the day, not every, say, middle class or upwardly mobile project that gets rolled out under the banner of BI necessarily then also helps the poor in those regions, or it helps the environment. So there's a whole lot of caveats that come with these various activities, and we need to be, I think, very careful about those as well. So overall, I think one of the major conclusions here is that the Chinese efforts to recalibrate worldwide and globe-spanning networks are taken up and challenged and revamped and reworked in various diverse ways by these different actors, which requires these kind of case studies. So if you're interested in learning more about this topic, we will have the publication out later this year in book form, open access, digital, for you to just access online. We also have information on our website and our newsletter, and you'll see a slide in a moment where you can reach us. One of the websites we are collaborating with, together with our partners at Klingendahl and several researchers, is the beltroadresearch.com website, where you will also find updates. So with that, I hand back to Lily in the studio, and thank you all for watching.
Thank you very much for wrapping up this meeting that touched on a variety of very interesting aspects. Like you said, the publication will be out with Amsterdam University Press sometime later this year. Follow us on the website, on Twitter or whatever to keep informed on the exact date. And I will once more, like Florian already did, thank the researchers here around the table, Matt in Berlin, and all our other colleagues who couldn't join us because lack of time or because they live in different time zones or for whatever reason. We hope to see them real soon again, and we will all be joining in at the presentation of the book later this year. To the audience, thank you very much for bearing with us for such a long time. We will be online with other issues as well, but I hope to see most of you at some point in the fall of this year. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the evening. It's dark here at Newsport, but that does not say anything about the daylight, I guess, and we hope to be with you again soon. Thank you very much here. Thank you.